Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Amatuzio, and I'm one of the members of the 2020 LakeSmart team with the Lake of the Woods District Stewardship Association. These are my team members.
Hi, I'm Bree.
Hi, I'm Abby.
This month, we've been trying to highlight some of the issues surrounding aquatic invasive species in the Lake of the Woods watershed. We asked you guys on social media some of your questions regarding invasive species, and we contacted an expert to answer all your questions. So please welcome Brook, the aquatic program specialist with the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Thanks for joining us today, Brook.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about aquatic invasive species. Obviously, on these crazy times right now, it's nice to be able to, do these types of things to reach Ontario's public. So yeah, as Jordan said, my name is Brook Schryer, and I'm the aquatic program specialist with the Invading Species Awareness Program and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the aquatic invasive species in the Lake of the Woods watershed, and talk about their identification, the impacts that they have on the environment, and some of the things that you can do as members of the public to prevent the spread, as well as report invasive species when you come across them.
Thank you so much. That was great. We had a couple questions from members that we wanted to throw at you as well, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, first off, how do invasive species impact Lake of the Woods?
So I think generally speaking, with the species that I've highlighted in the presentation today, I think you're very fortunate to start off. Lake of the Woods is very fortunate not to have as many invasive species as, say, like Southern Ontario or many of the jurisdictions on the south side of the Great Lakes Basin. So Lake of the Woods is still relatively pristine. So we need to keep it that way, right? Now, with the impacts that we are seeing, you're seeing those dense monocultures, you're seeing that loss of biodiversity, especially with something like rusty crayfish, right? The rusty crayfish that was introduced. So, as it hybridizes with native species like the northern clearwater crayfish. So they have, each species has a number of different impacts, but I think generally speaking, you're seeing that loss in biodiversity, which for an area like that, which is so biodiverse, you want to keep it that way. So I think we all have a role to play in that. So let's say you're an angler going south for an angling trip. Just make sure you're not bringing stuff back, right? Make sure you're not transporting back bait or something along those lines. Make sure that we're all doing our due diligence, whether we're going out in the field to go hunting for waterfowl or whether we're going boating. We all just need to do our part to prevent the spread so that we can ultimately protect the biodiversity of a region like Lake of the Woods.
Awesome. Next is, how can I stop the spread? You did kind of get into that already with the clean drain and all that.
Yeah, but I can reiterate, just learning to identify. Number one is learning to identify. Now, if that seems too daunting for you, if you're like, there are too many species, because trust me, there are a lot of invasive species. If it's too daunting for you, well, then you know what? Like you said, when you're leaving the water, whether it's a native or an invasive plant, doesn't matter, pull it off, right? Leave it there so that you're not transporting it elsewhere. So learning to identify is number one. However, if it's too daunting, start taking steps that, generally speaking, are going to reduce the risk of spreading aquatic invasive species as well as terrestrial invasive species.
Perfect.
We did also have a question regarding our beetle release, so I thought I'd pass it over to you because you're the expert. It was concern over releasing a biocontrol method and whether or not that would also become an invasive species over time.
Yeah, and I think that's a very legitimate question, right? It's one that we've all seen it, whether it's on the Simpsons episode where Bart takes the frog to Australia, then, introduces it, and then they introduce something else. Like there's always that, reaction to the introduction of certain things. And I think historically, we were really bad for that, right? Humans, generally speaking, were like, hey, we have this thing that eats X species, we have X species, so let's introduce it without a lot of thought given, right? Now, I think moving to modern day, I think we've come a long way with invasion biology, and we understand a lot more. And we're also more apt as a society to lean towards like the precautionary principle. So, if we just simply don't know the outcomes of something, we won't do it, right? Most of the time, don't get me wrong, we have our faults. However, when it comes to something like the beetles for purple loosestrife, I think there was enough research done there to understand that, no, actually, this is a very selective beetle. Like it's going to selectively eat purple loosestrife, it's going to enter into a predator-prey dynamic with purple loosestrife.
Mhm.
And, to date, like that release has been going on for a number of years. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen any real negative consequences as a result of that, besides the reduction of purple loosestrife populations. Now, again, like, don't get me wrong, like when you do that, when you enter that predator-prey dynamic, it's not going to fully eradicate purple loosestrife, right? So it's not the cure to the problem, but it's certainly a way to mitigate the impacts,
Mhm.
because with any predator, whether it's a wolf and a deer, it's not going to decimate the population of what it's eating. It understands that, hey, if I eat all of this, I'm not going to have any food, right? Now, obviously, it goes beyond that. It's not as black and white as that. But with beetles, as the population of purple loosestrife declines, so too does the population of beetles, right? And then the population of beetles will get to a point where they've reached a certain threshold where they're not able to keep up with the purple loosestrife. So all of a sudden, its population will go back up. And then in turn, what do you have? Increase of beetle population. So it enters a predator-prey dynamic, right? Where the predator is always slightly lagging the prey. So basically, to answer your question, modern day, we've done a good job, I think, understanding these things a lot better than what we did historically.
Right.
And in the past, it was a knee-jerk reaction, right? It was like, hey, let's introduce this species because it eats whatever. And there was a lot of mistakes that went into that, and we suffered as a result, and nature suffered. But yeah, in modern day, we are very careful on the whole with what we do, right? Like a perfect example is in Ontario and in Canada, we only have one herbicide that we're allowed to use on the water, right? Like we're very careful with what we're putting into our ecosystems. And I appreciate that being an Ontario citizen and understanding that, hey, it kind of stinks we don't have too many like tools in our toolbox when it comes to things like aquatic plants and trying to treat them with herbicides. But I also hugely respect the decision making that goes into that to say, maybe it's not good if we just spray all of these herbicides willy-nilly over our waters, right? We don't want that. And same goes for biocontrol. We don't want to be willy-nilly releasing all these biocontrol for certain species. But when there is an option, and when it is seemingly perfect and enough research has been done, like in the case of the beetles and the purple loosestrife, then hey, you do it.
Perfect. Thank
For
you.
sure. The next question is, if I find an invasive species on my property, should I report it? And is there a best practice for removing it?
Yeah, so best practices very specific to different species. Most species have different methods that you want to use to eradicate them. Now, like let's talk about like aquatic weeds, for example. Like if you have aquatic weed on your shoreline, that link that I had in that one slide, even if you just Google removing aquatic invasive weeds in Ontario, that'll be the first thing that pops up. And there are rules and things that you need to follow so that you're not impacting biodiversity, so that you're not impacting native species, right? Due diligence, and it'll walk you through all of that. So in the case of aquatic plants, like it can be a challenge. Don't get me wrong. It can be very challenging. It's arduous. These things are invasive for a reason. You don't just give the term invasive to any species. These are the species that are very good at filling a niche, very good at exploiting humans, and very good at staying where they are, right? So if you're trying to take them out, you might even like unintentionally spread them a little bit. But in my mind, it's always best to conduct active management rather than not manage at all. So with your Asian water milfoil, you know what? Yeah, if it's on your shoreline and you see dense patches of it, grab a rake and following the rules, obviously, making sure that you've properly identified the species, and then start pulling. Let it dry out, and then discard of it. Like discard the the biomass, right? Now, when it comes to terrestrials, it's almost each one is different. Japanese knotweed, the management that you're going to have to put into getting rid of some Japanese knotweed is going to be fundamentally different than trying to get rid of a patch of garlic mustard, right? So what I would encourage people to do is to go on to invadingspecies.com. We have all the different profiles for many species, common species that people may be dealing with, and they can actually find the best management practices guides. Now, the best management practices guides were developed by the Ontario Invasive Plant Council in partnership with us and the Invasive Species Center and the MNRF. So there was a lot of great minds that went into that. And what it does is it walks you through the biology of the plant, walks you through the different techniques that you can use. It'll tell you, hey, like these techniques will work a lot better than these techniques. It'll give you timing around when you should manage it so that you're doing the least amount of damage possible to other species, right? And also being cognizant of, especially with terrestrial plants, well, you want to get at it before it goes to seed, right? So it'll tell you all that timing. Like, you want to get a garlic mustard kind of earlier in the season before it goes to seed, especially when it's second year growth, right? So again, like no two species are kind of the same, but it is very important for people to report, because let's say they find one of these species, they want to report it to us. Well, guess what we're going to do? We're going to offer them all of those management techniques, right? We're going to give them the best management practices guide. So even if they're only simply reporting for the sake of curiosity to figure out what this plant is, and it does turn out to be an invader, we are going to help them by providing them with the resources that they need to then start conducting physical removal or mechanical removal or whatever is most effective for the species that they're dealing with.
In place of invasive species, are there any native plants to the Lake of the Woods area that we should be planting on our shorelines?
That's a tough one. It's a tough one only because there are different rules and regulations around the planting of plants along shorelines. So I grew up on Lake Scugog, and we know that you don't own essentially the shoreline, right? In our case, the Conservation Authority does, the province does. So in that case, you can't conduct any actual work on the shoreline unless we received a permit to do so, and it is part of the TSW, so it's actually technically Parks Canada. So that being said, there are different rules and regulations around working on shorelines, so I think it's really important for anybody wanting to do something like that to due diligence, do your research, right? Contact who you need to contact, and then looking at something like the Grow Me Instead guide for Northern Ontario. So making sure that you have that conversation with, if it's the nursery that you're going to or doing your own research online, just make sure that what you're planting is A, native, and B, that you're doing this all within the bounds of the rules and regulations that we work within in Ontario, right? Because you don't want to be introducing plants to the water if you're not allowed to do so. So just things to be mindful of.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was so great. Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed that, and I think it's really going to help our members and viewers learn more about invading species.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me, and I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Just want to reiterate, if you want to call us, 1-800-563-7711, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Right now, you'll get Jordan, who we hired to give us a hand, and I actually feel kind of bad because I didn't have her picture in my presentation, but she's a superstar. She's answering the phone for us, and then she's basically siphoning it down to the rest of us within the program. So give us a call. Otherwise, you can send us an email, info@invadingspecies.com. And then finally, if you want, create a profile, www.eddmaps.org/Ontario, and then start reporting that way.
Perfect. Before you go, I also want to thank our sponsors, which a few to mention are Wood Lake Marine, Q104, and the Grand Council at Tree Free, as well as all of our members for making presentations like this possible and for supporting the LakeSmart team. So,
you're a great group of people up there, so keep up the good work.
Yeah.
And if anyone else has any further questions about invasive species or just any other environmental questions, feel free to send us an email at info.lakesmart@loudside.com.
Thanks so much, guys.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
It's so fun.